Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a drag strip in 1965, the air thick with the smell of nitromethane, and a kid who's barely old enough to rent a car walks up to the starting line with a machine he built himself, tuned himself, and is about to run against the most experienced Nitro teams in the country. He's 21 years old. He's from Hawaii. He speaks with an accent so thick that his driver literally has to translate for him in the pit. And by the end of that weekend, he's going to win the two most important drag races in the entire sport, back to back, with a car nobody had ever heard of, driven by a guy who'd never won a national event. And then he's going to do the exact same thing the following year with a completely different driver, just to make sure everyone understood that it wasn't an accident. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the forgotten pioneers of American motorsports. If you're someone who loves the deep history of drag racing, the characters who built the sport from nothing, and the stories that never quite made it into the mainstream history books, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Roland Leong, the Hawaiian. Depending on how deep you are into drag racing history, that name either means absolutely everything to you or you've never heard it once in your life. And if it's the second one, I want to fix that today, because what this man built across 30 years of Nitro racing is genuinely one of the most remarkable stories the sport has ever produced. Not because he was the fastest, although sometimes he absolutely was. Not because he had the biggest budget, because he almost never did. But because he figured something out that almost nobody else in the history of this sport has ever managed to figure out. He built a brand that was bigger than any single driver who ever sat in his car. 21 different people drove for the Hawaiian program over 3 decades. Not one of them became the Hawaiian. The Hawaiian was always the Hawaiian, regardless of who was strapped into the seat. Here's the thing about drag racing history. The way we tell it is almost always through drivers. Prudhomme was the snake. McEwen was the mongoose. Garlits was Big Daddy. The driver was the identity. The car was just the machine underneath them. Roland Leong flipped that entire model. He made the team the identity, the car the brand, and the driver almost incidental to the larger story. And he did it in an era when that concept essentially didn't exist in motorsport at any level. Now, you might be thinking, okay, lots of team owners built recognizable brands. What makes this different? Here's what most people don't realize. Roland Leong started doing this in 1964 when he was 20 years old, before there was a template for it, before sports marketing was a real industry, before anyone was talking about brand identity in the context of a drag racing team. He wasn't following a model. He was creating one, and he probably didn't even know it at the time, because he was too busy trying to figure out how to make a Nitro Hemi go faster than Keith Black's last tune. Let's start at the actual beginning, because the origin story here matters more than people realize. Roland Hung Cho Leong was born in May of 1944 in Honolulu, Hawaii. His father James was Harvard-educated, described in some accounts as the first Asian student to earn a master's degree from that institution. His mother Theodora, who everyone called Teddy, was a University of Hawaii graduate, which was genuinely unusual for women of her generation. These were not people who existed on the margins of society. They were accomplished, educated, and by Hawaiian standards, relatively comfortable. And their son dropped out of school in the 11th grade to go drag racing, which must have been an interesting conversation at the dinner table. His first car was the family's 1959 Oldsmobile, which he took to Kahuku drag strip on the north shore of Oahu around 1960. Let that land for a second. He didn't start with some purpose-built race machine. He started with his parents' car on a local strip in Hawaii at 16 years old. From there, he progressed to a Dragmaster-built dragster with a supercharged Dodge Wedge engine. And he got fast enough that he was setting track records at Kahuku, 8.58 seconds at 180 miles per hour. For a kid on a local strip in Hawaii in the early 1960s, that was legitimately quick. The moment that changed everything came in 1963. A Hawaii businessman and racing promoter named Jimmy Pfluger opened Hawaii Raceway Park in Ava and brought in some mainland stars for demonstration runs. Specifically, he brought Tommy Greer as a car owner, Keith Black as his engine builder, and a 22-year-old driver from California named Don Prudhomme, who was becoming one of the most talked-about young talents in Top Fuel. They came out with the famous Greer Black Prudhomme dragster, and Roland Leong watched them run. And then he walked over and introduced himself, and something clicked. Prudhomme and Leong were basically the same person in terms of how consumed they were by this sport. Two young guys who thought about almost nothing except making a car go faster, talking to each other for the first time at a strip in Hawaii in 1963. That meeting changed the trajectory of both of their careers, and it ultimately changed drag racing itself. Jim Nelson, who co-owned Dragmaster Chassis in Carlsbad, California, convinced Leong to relocate to the mainland. Teddy Leong arranged a job for her son at the Dragmaster shop, where Roland learned welding and chassis construction. He was maybe 17 or 18 years old. And then he ended up under Keith Black's wing at Black's shop in Southgate, California. And that's where he learned to build and tune Nitro HEMAs. Black became Leong's primary mentor, and that relationship would define the Hawaiian program for the next 30 years. Here's something worth sitting with. Teddy Leong funded most of this. She bought Roland's first 2 or 3 Dragmaster cars and later his Top Fuel car. He acknowledged this directly in multiple interviews. Without his parents, he said, he couldn't have done it financially. The self-made legend framing that gets attached to Leong is accurate in every technical sense of what he built and accomplished. But the foundation of early funding came from a mother who believed in something that most families in Hawaii probably thought was some kind of temporary madness. That's the part of the story that rarely gets told. So Roland is now in Southern California, late 1963, early 1964. He has a car. He has a mentor. He has the knowledge base to build a serious Nitro program. A painter named Joe Anderson was finishing up the bodywork on Leong's dragster and asked what to call it. And Leong said he didn't know. And Anderson said, "Well, you're from Hawaii, why not call it the Hawaiian?" And that was literally how it happened. Anderson painted it sky blue metal flake and lettered it in what became the Hawaiian's trademark bamboo-style font, the letters shaped to look like bamboo stalk. And that visual identity stayed with the program across 30 years of cars, 11 national event wins, and 21 different drivers. A painter asking a question and a kid shrugging. That's how one of the most iconic brand identities in motorsport history was born. Now, the first thing Roland Leong did with this brand new car, and this brand new identity, was try to drive it himself. This is where the story takes a turn that is both genuinely funny and also explains everything about how the Hawaiian program became what it eventually became. Leong went to Lyons Drag Strip in Long Beach in 1964, which was one of the premier Nitro strips in Southern California at the time, and made his first pass in the brand new Hawaiian Top Fuel dragster, powered by a Keith Black-built Nitro Hemi. He went through the lights. He couldn't find the parachute handle. The car sailed past the shutdown area at over 191 miles per hour, rolled off the end of the track, and ended up on the railroad tracks beyond the far end of the strip. The car was destroyed. Total career as a Nitro driver: 1 pass, 8.01 seconds. 3 different pressures immediately converged on him after this. Keith Black told Leong he was afraid for him, and refused to continue tuning for him as long as Leong was behind the wheel. His mother made clear she was not okay with her son in that seat now that he had a wife and a baby daughter. And the NHRA denied him a competition driving license. That's your mentor, your mother, and the sanctioning body all pointing in the same direction at the same time. And Keith Black delivered the advice that redirected the entire story. Become a car owner and hire Don Prudhomme. This is where drag racing history pivot. Leong was maybe 20 years old. The Greer Black Prudhomme team had recently dissolved, leaving Prudhomme available. Leong approached him. Prudhomme signed on to drive the rebuilt Hawaiian top fuel dragster. The car ran a Kent Fuller chassis with Keith Black building the engines on a 392 cubic inch supercharged Chrysler Hemi fueled by nitromethane. What happened next was one of the most dominant single seasons any owner-driver combination has ever produced in top fuel. At the 1965 NHRA Winternationals in Pomona, the Hawaiian won top fuel eliminator. Prudhomme ran a 7.76 at 201.34 miles per hour and beat Wild Bill Alexander in the final. This was Prudhomme's first national event victory in top fuel. He was 24 years old. Leong was 20. Then they went to Indianapolis for the U.S. Nationals, which is the biggest race in drag racing, and won that too. Low elapsed time of the meet, 7.504 seconds. Beat Tommy Evo in the final. Keith Black flew to Indy specifically to supervise the tune-up. Roland Leong became the first owner to sweep the Winternationals and the U.S. Nationals in the same season in top fuel. He was 21 years old and had been making Nitro passes as an owner for maybe 2 years. Here's what most people don't realize about what happened next. Prudhomme left after the 1965 season to run his own program. And a lot of people assumed that the Hawaiian wins had been about Prudhomme's talent, that Leong had been the lucky beneficiary of having the best driver in the sport in his car. So Leong replaced him with Mike Snively, who he'd known from his dragmaster days, a solid driver but not the name Prudhomme was. And in 1966, Snively did the exact same thing. Won the Winternationals. Won the U.S. Nationals. Different driver, identical result. You cannot make a clearer argument for the tuner being the decisive variable. Back-to-back seasons, 2 different drivers sitting in the car, same 2 races won. The wins had been about Roland Leong's ability to read a car, understand the data available to him with the primitive instrumentation of mid-1960s nitro racing, make adjustments nobody else was making, and consistently put his driver in position to go rounds when it mattered most. Snively continued through 1967 and 1968. In 1967, Leong ran 2 Hawaiian dragsters simultaneously. Snively in the primary car, a second driver named Mike Sorokin in what they called the B car. The B car was significant because it ran the new 426 cubic inch late model Chrysler Hemi, and through Keith Black's connections to Chrysler's Marine Division, Leong was the first team on the West Coast to run this engine in a nitro car. Only Don Garlits and the Ramchargers had gotten their first nationally. The 426 was the future, and Leong was right there at the front of it. The team won the 1967 Bakersfield March Meet and the Hot Rod Magazine Championships at Riverside. By any measure, it had been a dominant run across 3 seasons. But the Leong and Snively partnership deteriorated by late 1968, and they parted ways. And the original 1965 Hawaiian dragster, the car that had won 2 national titles with 2 different drivers, was sold through Ray Brock of Hot Rod magazine to a European show promoter, and ended up at the Museo Nazionale dell'Automobile in Turin, Italy. Under Italian law, any object over 50 years old is classified as a cultural asset and cannot leave the country. So if you want to see the most historically significant Hawaiian dragster, you need a passport and a flight to Turin. It's not coming back. The car that started the legend is in a museum in northern Italy, and has been there since 1968. That's a strange and somehow perfect ending for an object that's strange and perfect. Now, Leong had to make a decision. Match race bookings were getting harder to secure for top fuel dragsters, while funny cars were getting more dates at more tracks and more money per appearance. Leong was a businessman as much as he was a racing obsessive, and the math pointed one direction. He told Drag Illustrated, "The funny car guys were getting a lot more dates than we did. It just seemed like the funny cars had become a lot more popular. This is where it gets really interesting. because the move from Top Fuel to Funny Car in 1969 produced one of the most iconic moments in the history of the sport and also one of the most terrifying. For the 1969 Winternationals at Pomona, Leong showed up with a full-sized 1969 Dodge Charger 500 fiberglass body on a Logie Brothers chassis, driven by Larry Reyes, a veteran California racer. Reyes had told Leong before the race that he didn't like the car. It was too big and he couldn't see out of it properly. Leong heard him. The Winternationals were happening anyway. In round 1, Reyes beat Larry Christopherson with an 8.14 at 181.45 miles per hour. And then the car went into the shutdown area and took off. Not metaphorically. The car left the ground, barrel rolled multiple times at over 180 miles per hour, and the crowd watched in absolute horror. The aerodynamic problem was specific and devastating. The car had a deep front air dam to generate downforce at the front but essentially no rear downforce. The stock rear lip spoiler on a full-size Charger body was nowhere near sufficient for a car generating 181 miles per hour of airspeed. The front air dam was essentially creating a wing effect that lifted the entire rear end of the car off the ground. Once that started, nothing could stop it. National Dragster managing editor Lane Evans had his camera pointed at the shutdown area and captured the car at what appears to be maximum altitude, barrel rolling clear of the ground, on what turned out to be the last frame on his roll of film. That image became one of the most iconic photographs in the history of the sport. Larry Reyes walked away unhurt. The car was completely destroyed. And Roland Leong's reaction was reportedly something close to, "We went through the lights upside down, but we still won the race." That line. That one line tells you almost everything you need to know about this man. Look, within hours of that crash at the 1969 Winternationals, people from the Logie Brothers shop and Keith Black's crew were already making phone calls and planning what came next. That response time matters. A lot of programs would have taken a moment, maybe stepped back, reassessed, maybe quietly exited the funny car business entirely after watching their brand new car barrel roll at 180 miles per hour on its very first run at its very first national event. Leong was on the phone planning the next car before the wreckage was cold. What came next is actually the engineering story that defined the Hawaiian funny car program for the next 2 decades. Leong worked with Ron Pellegrini of Fiberglass Limited to develop what became known as the Mini Charger body. A radically downsized version of the Dodge Charger that was roughly 15 inches shorter in length, 8 inches narrower, and 3 inches lower in the roofline than the original production body. It went on a new Logie Stage 2 chassis with a 118 to 120-inch wheelbase. A proper molded rear spoiler provided the downforce the original car had catastrophically lacked. The whole thing looked like a Charger that had been put in a dryer on high heat and left running for too long. Shrunken down to the point where it almost looked cartoonish next to the original. But the aerodynamics were sorted, the visibility for the driver was dramatically better, and it turned out to be one of the fastest funny car bodies anyone had produced to that point. Here's what most people don't realize about that Mini Charger body. It wasn't technically legal for NHRA competition initially because it deviated too far from the production body dimensions the rules required. So through most of the 1969 season, Leong ran it exclusively on the match race circuit rather than at NHRA national event. And the match race circuit turned out to be exactly the right place to debut it, because what the Mini Charger needed was momentum, and momentum came from wins and word of mouth and track promoters calling each other. The debut weekend, around Memorial Day 1969, produced wins at Irwindale, then OCR, then Carlsbad. 3 tracks in a single weekend. The number that gets cited from that weekend is $7,500 in appearance fees and winnings for a 2-car team with no major sponsor. In 1969 money, that was not nothing. That was what the match race circuit could deliver when you had a fast car, a recognizable name, and a body that the crowds had never seen before and couldn't stop talking about. By 1970, they had a version of the body that met NHRA dimensional requirements, and Larry Reyes, the same driver who had walked away from the barrel roll the year before, won the Winternationals Funny Car Eliminator. The Hawaiian had won the Winternationals at Pomona 3 times in 4 seasons, twice in Top Fuel, once in Funny Car. At a track where most teams were genuinely happy to make the quarterfinals. Think about what that means statistically. The Winternationals is held once per year. Leong won it in 1965, 1966, and 1970. In 4 of the 5 years between 1965 and 1970, his program either won or was running for the championship at Pomona. One track, the biggest track, the most important early season race in the sport. He owned it. Reyes left the program in September 1970. On good terms, he later said. He just didn't really like traveling that much, which is a pretty reasonable thing to realize about a lifestyle that means loading a race car into a trailer and driving to a different city 4 nights a week, 50 weeks a year. Leong brought in Butch Moss to finish the 1970 season. Moss had earned his funny car license in Don Prudhomme's Hot Wheels Barracuda, which is a detail that underlines how small this world was. Everyone knew everyone. The ecosystem of top-level Nitro racing in Southern California in 1970 was maybe 100 people at the absolute most. Early in 1971, Butch Moss won the Winternationals. His run, 6.93 seconds at 212 miles per hour. That was the low elapsed time of the entire meet. The 1971 car was a significant technical step forward. A new narrow loggy chassis, dragster-style roll cage construction, detail work from legendary fabricator John Butera, and a Lenco 2-speed transmission with a Crower glide clutch replacing the torque flight automatic the earlier cars had run. Moss then got burned in a match race fire in Cincinnati and left to recover. And the driving seat shuffled again. This was actually the pattern for the next decade, and you need to understand it to understand what made the Hawaiian unusual. The car kept going and winning, and the driver's seat kept cycling through a roster of names. Bobby Rowe, then Leroy Chatterton, then Gordy Bonin, then Mike Van Sant, then Denny Savage, then Norm Wilcox, then Larry Arnold. Names that are familiar to serious drag racing historians, but not exactly household words to a casual observer. None of them stayed long. None of them became the face of the program. Because the face of the program was the car itself, the bamboo lettering, the blue metal flake, the Hawaiian identity. You have to understand what the 1970s match race circuit actually was to appreciate what Roland Leong was building during this period. This was not a structured season with a championship at the end and points races every weekend. This was show business on wheels. Track promoters paid guaranteed appearance fees for 3 runs regardless of outcome. You showed up, you made your burnout, you ran 3 passes against whatever local hero they'd booked as your opponent, and you got paid and went home. The format was best of 3, and showmanship counted as much as speed. Big burnouts, dry hops, anything that got the crowd on their feet. Top teams were racing Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at different tracks across the country. An ideal season was booked solid before you ever left home, through booking agents like Ira Litchie's Gold Agency in Chicago and promoters who had relationships with track operators from coast to coast. Phil Burgess of National Dragster described it perfectly years later. If you were a fan anywhere in the country in the 1970s, Leong's Hawaiian probably came to your local track. That wasn't an exaggeration. It was a statement about the sheer volume of miles and events the Hawaiian program covered in any given year. Here's the thing about the match race era that modern fans sometimes miss. The money was actually better on the match race circuit than it was at national events for most of the 1970s. Appearance fees guaranteed income regardless of performance. National events meant elimination racing where one bad run sent you home with nothing. For a single car operation without corporate backing, the guaranteed fee model was more sustainable and more profitable than betting everything on elimination outcomes at a handful of major events per year. Leong understood this before most of his peers did. He was running the Hawaiian as a business, not just as a racing program. That combination, the business sense layered on top of the technical expertise, is what kept the operation alive and competitive through 30 years when the majority of his contemporaries had long since closed up. Ron Coulson became the Hawaiian's driver in mid-1976 and stayed for 4.5 years, which made him the longest-tenured driver in the program's history by a significant margin. Coulson won the 1978 Fall Nationals, which was one of the legitimate signature wins of the match race era for the team. And then he won the 1980 NHRA Winston World Finals at Ontario Motor Speedway, which was also the last drag race ever held at Ontario before the facility closed permanently. Leong has a habit of being present for historically significant moments. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when you've been consistently competitive for long enough that you're simply there when history happens. During part of this era, Leong also did something that surprises people when they first hear it. He ran Chevrolet bodies. From roughly 1975 through 1979, the Hawaiian wore Chevy Monza and then Corvette fiberglass rather than Dodge or Plymouth bodywork. This is the only departure from Chrysler products in the team's entire history. And it was a pragmatic decision about what bodies were most popular with fans at different tracks and what sponsors were interested in attaching their names to. Here's the thing. The bamboo lettering came with it. The Hawaiian identity came with it. It didn't matter what bodywork was bolted to the chassis. The program was the program. That's how thoroughly Leong had built the brand identity into something independent of the specific machine. King's Hawaiian Bread showed up as a sponsor on the Corvette Funny Car around 1979 and 1980, which was a genuinely on-brand pairing for a Hawaiian-themed racing program, even if it had nothing to do with the Leong family personally. The visual story of that car, Hawaiian identity on a Corvette body with King's Hawaiian Bread across the quarter panels, was coherent in a way that felt almost planned, even though it came together through a series of pragmatic decisions rather than any formal brand strategy. Ron Coulson's last race with the Hawaiian being the final event at Ontario Motor Speedway is one of those historical footnotes that is simultaneously minor and enormous. He won. The track closed. The Hawaiian moved on. That's basically the structure of the entire program in miniature. Now, the man who took the driving seat when Coulson left was Mike Dunn. And Dunn's story is actually one of the more revealing accounts of what it was like to be inside the Hawaiian program. Dunn had come to Leong as a crew member in 1977, at maybe 20 years old. Leong liked what he saw. The kid was smart, willing to learn, and showed real aptitude for the mechanical side of things. Leong helped him get seat time in another team's car to develop his skills and eventually promoted him to full-time Hawaiian driver. Leong also introduced Dunn to the woman who became his wife, Sandy. And by Dunn's own account, they've been married over 41 years. So Leong's influence on that relationship turned out to be even more lasting than the racing part. The racing part was genuinely mixed. Dunn was quick and he understood the car, but he also had what he later described with some humor as an unusual pattern of accidents, specifically while driving for Roland. He told interviewers that he'd never crashed a car before the Hawaiian and never crashed a car after the Hawaiian, but managed to wreck 4 of Leong's cars during his time there. A catastrophic barrel roll at the 1983 NHRA World Finals at OCR destroyed 1 car. Then in 1984, a coupler failure at a race in Kansas City broke his leg and ended his Hawaiian tenure. Now, you might be thinking that sounds like an indictment of the program. 4 cars wrecked with 1 driver in a relatively short period. But here's the context. Dunn later won 22 NHRA national events, drove for multiple top teams, became an ESPN analyst, and served as president of the NHRA. His career after the Hawaiian was one of the most accomplished in the sport. The crashes weren't about his ability. They were about the inherent violence of running a Nitro funny car at the absolute edge of what the technology could handle in the early 1980s, when the speeds were increasing faster than the engineering solutions to manage them. The 1983 season is actually where the financial story of the Hawaiian takes its most significant turn. Hawaiian Punch, the fruit drink brand that was then owned by Del Monte, signed on as the primary sponsor. This partnership ran from 1983 through 1991, and multiple sources describe it as one of the longest-running title sponsorships in drag racing history for that era. The cars went from whatever branding Leong could piece together to a vivid blue and red Hawaiian Punch livery with the brand's signature glass of fruit punch on the hood. If you're of a certain age and you grew up watching NHRA racing on Wide World of Sports or reading National Dragster, you know exactly what these cars looked like. That color scheme became one of the most recognizable paint schemes in the sport. Revell made model kits of those cars. Hot Wheels eventually produced diecast versions. Auto World made a 1/18 scale tribute. The visual language was strong enough to generate licensing revenue decades after the original car stopped racing. The driver who replaced Dunn in mid-1984 was Rick Johnson, and what Johnson did in the 1985 season almost defies the numbers when you look back at them. At the Winternationals that year, Johnson ran a 5.58 at 263.62 miles per hour. That run broke the all-time funny car elapsed time record that had been held by Don Prudhomme. The man whose career was intertwined with Leong's from the very beginning, the driver who had given the Hawaiian its first national event win in 1965, now held the funny car ET record, and Roland Leong's car just took it from him. There is something almost too neat about that. Like the sport itself was writing a story. The whole 1985 season ran at that level. Johnson finished second in NHRA funny car points behind only Kenny Bernstein, which at that time was the highest championship finish in Hawaiian program history. For a single-car owner-tuner operation to be the second-best funny car team in the country, while the top spot belongs to a program with Budweiser money and a full-time professional operation behind it, is genuinely extraordinary. Budweiser was spending money that no independent owner could match. And Leong was right behind them with one car, one engine program, and a tuning instinct that nobody in the sport could fully explain. This is where it gets really interesting, because what Johnson accomplished in 1985 set up what Leong was quietly building toward through the late 1980s. Johnson left after that season over disagreements that were vaguely described in contemporary accounts. Johnny West replaced him and drove through the late 1980s without quite recapturing the 1985 peak. But Leong was working on something. He identified specific things he wanted to change about how the car made power and how the clutch was managed. He brought in crew chief Wes Cerny, and the two of them spent nearly 2 years, while still match racing and running NHRA events, systematically refining the fuel delivery system, the clutch setup, and experimenting with cylinder head configurations alongside a builder named Leonard Hughes, whose heads turned out to be the missing piece in the technical package. The improvements came gradually through 1989 and 1990. Jim White had taken over as driver in 1989. And then in 1991, everything converged in a way that made the Hawaiian funny car one of the fastest things in motorsports, regardless of category. At the 1991 U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis, Jim White won Funny Car Eliminator. He also won the Big Bud Shootout at the same event, which was a special all-star race separate from the main eliminations. He qualified number 1. He ran the top speed of the entire meet. He ran the low elapsed time of the entire meet. The numbers were 288 miles per hour, which at that specific moment in time was faster than any top fuel dragster was running. A funny car, with its heavier body and more aerodynamic drag, was outrunning the open-wheel cars. That is a genuinely staggering thing to type, and it was a genuinely staggering thing to witness if you were standing at Indianapolis Motor Speedway's drag strip in August of 1991. They went to the Keystone Nationals and ran 289.94 miles per hour. Then to the Texas Motorplex outside Dallas for the Chief Nationals. The speed on that run was 290.13 miles per hour. The Hawaiian funny car became the first funny car in history to break the 290-mile-per-hour barrier. They closed the season at the Winston Finals with 291.82 miles per hour, which became the NHRA funny car national speed record. The elapsed time record was 5.17 seconds. They finished second in the championship behind John Force, which in 1991 was essentially the only acceptable reason to not be champion. NHRA later ranked the 1991 Jim White Hawaiian as the 18th best funny car of all time. For a single-car independent operation competing against factory-backed programs with exponentially larger budgets, that ranking represents something that goes well beyond good result. It represents a level of technical excellence that the sport's own historians had to formally acknowledge. Now here's the piece of the 1991 story that most people genuinely don't know. Wes Cerny, who had been the engineering brain behind much of the technical leap the Hawaiian made that season, left after the year when Kenny Bernstein hired him away. And the cylinder head knowledge and clutch understanding that Cerny took to that program in 1992 contributed directly to Bernstein's car breaking 300 miles per hour, which was the first 300-mile-per-hour run in the history of drag racing. There is a direct line from the work Leong and Cerny did together on the 1991 Hawaiian to the first time a drag car ever broke that barrier. That is not a small thing. That is a contribution to the technical history of the sport that extends well beyond any win or record the Hawaiian car itself achieved. Hawaiian Punch as a sponsorship partner ended after 1991. Leong sat out 1992. He came back in 1993 with Gordy Bonin, who was returning for a second stint in the Hawaiian seat, running a car that carried Hawaii tourism branding under the theme Hawaiian Vacation. The funding dried up during the season and Leong stepped back from car ownership for the first time in nearly 30 years. It would not be accurate to describe what followed as retirement. In 1996, he served as crew chief for Ray Higley's Red Line Oil Dodge Avenger. And then something happened that closed a circle the sport had spent 30 years drawing. Don Prudhomme called. The driver who had given the Hawaiian its first national event win in 1965. The man who Leong had approached as a 20-year-old with an accent so thick that Prudhomme had to translate for him at the track. The Snake himself, now running one of the most established operations in NHRA funny car. Prudhomme called and asked Leong to tune the Copenhagen funny car for a young driver named Ron Capps in 1997 and 1998. Leong signed on. And that combination won at St. Louis in 1997, then won the Winternationals and the Big Bud Shootout at Indianapolis in 1998. They finished second in championship points behind John Force. Again, the pattern of Leong-tuned cars finishing second to John Force in the late 1990s is almost comedic if you think about it too hard. Force was spending money at a level that made second place the genuinely correct result for everyone else. And Leong was right there in second, with a borrowed seat in someone else's program, winning more NHRA national events than anyone else in funny car that year. Ron Capps went on to become one of the great funny car champions of his era. Multiple times over, Leong had spotted something in a young driver and helped develop it. That's the other through line of the Hawaiian story that doesn't get discussed enough. The people who came through that program. Mike Dunn won 22 NHRA national events after leaving the Hawaiian. Ron Capps became a champion. Danny Ongace, who had driven for Leong even earlier in the Top Gas era before any of this, went on to win the 24 Hours of Daytona and qualify for 10 consecutive Indianapolis 500. He is the only driver in history to win both the NHRA U.S. Nationals and the 24 Hours of Daytona. Don Prudhomme won 4 NHRA Funny Car Championships and built one of the most successful driver development programs in the sport. These are not coincidental outcomes. These are the results of a person who understood talent, who gave people opportunities at the right moment, and who created an environment where serious racers could develop and perform. That's leadership. It's also the quietest part of the Hawaiian legacy, the one that doesn't show up in elapsed time records or national event wins. From 2009 onward, Leong was active in the NHRA Hot Rod Heritage Series, crew-chiefing old funny cars at nostalgia events. He was a fixture at these shows, signing autographs, telling stories, surrounded by people who had grown up watching the Hawaiian and simply wanted to shake his hand and say they'd been there. In 2014, a Canadian racer named Ron Hodgson hired him to tune the Troy Lee Designs Nitro funny car for heritage competition. The governor of Hawaii gave Leong a state capital proclamation in 2019, recognizing 55 years as what they called a global ambassador in preserving and promoting Hawaii's rich heritage and culture of motorsports. The Hawaii Sports Hall of Fame inducted him in the class of 2020. The Hawaii Motorsports Hall of Fame added him in 2023. Lou Hart spent years working on the official biography. Roland Leong, the Hawaiian, drag racing's iconic top fuel owner and tuner. Published by Cartech in August of 2023. Don Prudhomme wrote the foreword. The book was delivered to Leong weeks before his death, and he got to see his complete story told in print. That matters in a way that's hard to fully articulate. Roland Leong died on December 29, 2023, at his home in Silicon Beach, California. He was 79 years old. Nearly 500 people came to his celebration of life on March 21, 2024, at the Lions Automobilia Foundation. Don Prudhomme hosted it. Prudhomme said publicly that they were like brothers, that he was closer to Roland than to his own brother, and that they had been friends for nearly 60 years from the moment they met on a strip in Hawaii in 1963. That friendship began when two young men who were essentially the same person, both obsessed with the same thing, both willing to sacrifice almost everything else for it, happened to be standing in the same place at the same time. So what made the Hawaiian something people remember across 60-plus years of drag racing history? Because it wasn't just the competitiveness. Plenty of cars win races and get forgotten. The sport produces dominant teams in cycles, and most of them fade when the money moves or the driver retires or the rules change. The Hawaiian kept generating memory across 30 years and multiple rule sets and multiple competitive eras. That requires something more than just being fast. The first thing is the brand itself, and I keep coming back to this because I think it's genuinely underappreciated. In an era when racing programs were identified primarily by their drivers, when the Snake and the Mongoose and Big Daddy were the identities that fans organized their loyalty around, the Hawaiian inverted the entire model. The car was the brand. The team was the identity. The driver was the person in the seat that week, this month, this season. 21 people drove for the Hawaiian program over 30 years. Not one of them became the Hawaiian. Prudhomme left and went on to his own legendary career and became one of the great driver brands in the sport's history. The Hawaiian kept going without him and kept winning. Snively left and the wins continued. Reyes left and the wins continued. Coulson, Dunn, Johnson, West, White. Every time a driver left, the assumption from outside the program was probably that this was the end, that the car would struggle, that the identity had been tied too closely to whoever was currently in the seat. And every time, Leong put someone new in there and went rounds. That's not luck across 30 years. That is a repeatable system. That is a tuner and a builder who understood what made a nitro car go fast well enough that the human variable in the cockpit, while important, was never the limiting factor. Here's what most people don't realize about the visual identity side of this. The bamboo lettering that Joe Anderson painted on that first car in 1964 was not just a logo. It was a signal. In the context of American motorsport in the 1960s, that visual language communicated something specific and unusual. It said, "This is not from here. Not from Southern California, not from the Southeast, not from any of the geographic centers of power in American racing. This is from somewhere else, and it's going to beat you anyway. The blue metal flake became instantly recognizable at tracks where the Hawaiian had never run before. The meticulous preparation, the immaculate presentation, the cars that looked like they belonged in a magazine even at 2 in the morning being loaded onto a trailer in Indiana after a match race, that was a deliberate statement about what this program was. Leong took pride in presentation because presentation was part of what you were selling on the match race circuit. You were selling a show as much as you were selling a race. In an era when sports marketing was not yet a real profession, when nobody was talking about brand equity in the context of a drag racing team, Roland Leong intuitively built something that had brand equity. The Revell model kits, the Hot Wheels diecast, the Auto World 1/18 scale tribute. These don't exist for cars that were just fast. These exist for cars that meant something to people who watched them, that lived in the imagination past the moment when the chutes deployed and the run ended. Now, you might be thinking about the outsider narrative here, and I want to address it directly because it's easy to romanticize and harder to sit with honestly. Leong told Drag Illustrated, "Coming from Hawaii, the culture, the people, there are so many things that are different, and I felt like everybody was staring at me because I looked different. In the early 60s, there weren't very many Hawaiian or Asian or Pacific Island people on the mainland. Prudhomme literally did the talking for him at tracks in the early days because Leong's accent was so heavy that he was hard to understand. This is where it gets really interesting because that friction, that experience of being visibly different in a world that wasn't built for you, shaped the Hawaiian identity in a way that went beyond marketing. The name wasn't a gimmick. It was accurate. It was this person's actual origin and actual identity, and he never let it fade or soften it into something more palatable for a predominantly white racing establishment. Every car that carried that bamboo lettering was making a statement about who built it and where that person came from. In American motorsports in the 1960s and 1970s, that took something. Not dramatic courage in the way that word gets overused, but a steady, consistent refusal to minimize yourself in spaces that were clearly not designed with you in mind. And then winning in those spaces. Winning the biggest race in the sport. Winning it again. Building a program that lasted 30 years and produced records and champions and careers. Larry Reyes, who walked away from the 1969 barrel roll, was involved in a devastating crash at a match race in Norwalk, California in June of 1971, when a blown tire caused an accident that permanently paralyzed him. A benefit race raised money for his medical bills. He later made a brief return driving a super gas car with hand controls. He told NHRA in an interview years later that he had no regrets about anything that happened. That's the kind of statement that hits different when you understand exactly what he was talking about. The original 1969 Mini Charger body and Logie Stage 2 chassis survived. Restored to period-correct condition, part of a private collection, and video of it running was shared with Leong while he was still alive. That matters. He got to see the machine that defined the funny car chapter of his program run again before he died. The original 1965 Hawaiian Top Fuel dragster, the car that won 2 national titles with 2 different drivers in consecutive seasons and launched the entire legend, sits in the Museo Nazionale dell'Automobile in Turin, Italy. A writer named Tony Thacker went to visit it in 2016 and described the experience as something like meeting an old friend and realizing you both got old. Under Italian law, it cannot leave the country. The car that started all of this is in a museum in northern Italy, and it is not coming back. There is something fitting about that, in a strange way. The physical object that began the Hawaiian story is preserved somewhere it can never be forgotten, in a national museum that recognized it as culturally significant enough to classify as a protected asset. The Italians looked at a blue metal flake top fuel dragster from Southern California and said this belongs to history. They were right. It does. What Roland Leong built across his lifetime in this sport was a program that operated as something the sport had never quite seen before and hasn't entirely replicated since. 21 drivers. Approximately 15 NHRA national event wins. The first funny car to break 290 miles per hour. Back-to-back sweeps of the Winternationals and the U.S. Nationals in consecutive seasons with 2 different drivers. A technical contribution that traces a direct line to the first 300-mile-per-hour pass in drag racing history. A brand identity that generated licensing revenue 3 decades after the last car ran. He did all of this without ever driving a competitive race himself beyond 8 seconds on a rail that ended up on railroad track. He did it as one of the very few Asian American team owners the sport has ever produced, certainly the first to operate at that level of achievement in an era when that meant something specific and difficult about who you were allowed to be in American motorsport. He did it by being smarter than most of the people around him about what made these cars go fast, and by building something around that knowledge that outlasted every individual who contributed to it. He did it, ultimately, because a painter asked him what to call a car and he said he didn't know, and the painter said, "Well, you're from Hawaii." And the answer turned out to be the most durable brand in the history of the sport. That's what the Hawaiian was. And if you've spent 30 seconds watching Nitro burn and wondering about the people who figured out how to make it work, Roland Leong is the person you needed to know about. There is still nothing else quite like it in 60 years of drag racing history. There probably won't be again. If this is the kind of deep dive racing history you want more of, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing. We'll be back with more stories about the people and machines that built this sport before most of us were paying attention. See you on the next one.